Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of SportTechie Live. I'm Dan Kaufman, SportTechie's Managing Director. Thank you for being here. This is Innovation Through Sports, Advancing Athlete Health and Wealth. It's powered by our friends at the NFLPA. Thanks so much for the support. And thank you for being here. I have a few logistics that I'll go over, as I always do, for these SportTechie Live episodes. And then I will turn it over to our panel to start the discussion. First, hello to everyone out there. I want your interaction and engagement. That means make sure you introduce yourself in the chat here. Tell us who you are and where you're coming from and what you do. And if you see friends or colleagues who are introducing themselves in the chat, feel free to say hello to them. Please use the chat feature. It's a great way to get the audience engaged here. And then right next to the chat feature, to the left, at least for me, is a questions tab. That's where I want to make sure that you submit your questions to the panelists here. Don't wait till the end. There's no 5-minute Q&A at the end. We want you to submit your questions throughout. As you think of them, put them in there, and also monitor the other questions that go in there, because you can upvote questions. So if you see a question that you really want us to get to, make sure you upvote it. All right, that's it for my logistics. Let's dive right in. I'm going to give each of the panelists a moment to introduce themselves, and then we'll get to the questions. And I will start with Christy. Christy, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christy Arbogast. I'm the co-scientific director of the Center for Injury Research and Prevention at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And I also serve as a consultant for the NFL Players Association on a variety of injury prevention measures.
Thank you, Christy. Jay.
Hi, my name is Jay Alberts. I'm from the Cleveland Clinic. I am in the Department of Biomedical Engineering and the Vice Chair of Innovations for the Neurological Institute. Been working with Sean on some analytics and modeling, as well as leading the Brain and Body program for the NFLPA Trust for former players.
Thank you, Jay. Sean.
Thank you, Dan, and thanks SportTechie and Sports Business Journal for hosting us today. Sean Sansbury, General Counsel and Head of Business Affairs with the NFLPA and NFL Players, Inc., our for-profit subsidiary. I also run our health and safety, medical research, and strategic growth programs.
Thank you, Sean. All right, folks, I see everyone introduce themselves in the chat. Keep that coming in. Let us know who you are and where you're coming from. And don't forget to submit your questions throughout. I'll start with a question that I think will get the conversation going. Again, we're talking about advancing athlete health and wealth through innovation. And we've got some interesting things to cover. I want to start with a broad question to get us going. What are the current issues that the NFLPA is most focused on when it comes to player safety on the field? And I'll kick that off probably to Sean, and maybe Jay, Christy, feel free to chime in.
Sure. So two things we often say in the context of player health and safety. First, whole player, whole family, whole life. And second, we say it's our obligation to constantly challenge the NFL as the employer to be better when it comes to player health and safety. No matter how far we've come, there is always room for improvement. So we could likely spend the entire panel just talking about on-field safety issues, but I'll highlight a few topics that have certainly bubbled up this season. Field safety. It's really been a hot topic lately, from field turf construction to cleat interaction with field surface, new testing tools, metrics, things that actually allow us to judge a field's safety and performance characteristics. Then we have the larger and certainly related category of injury mitigation, from concussions all the way down to lower extremity injuries. And then I'd also highlight prescription drug practices has been and continues to be a big focus. The NFL and the NFLPA have the first ever prescription drug registry program in the history of professional sports. And through that, we seek to make targeted changes to how players receive pharmacologics. And then lastly, I want to mention diversity. With a player population that is over 70% Black, we are working very hard to get more diverse positions on the sideline.
Thank you, Sean. So it sounds like field safety, concussions, and other body injuries, prescription drug issues, and then diversity, more diverse medical staff.
Absolutely. Those four have been and will continue to be front of mind for us.
Got it. When it comes to field safety, let's dive into that a little bit more. And maybe I'll start the conversation this way. What are the types of injuries that are the most focused right now? You mentioned concussions. We obviously saw recently the incident with Tua in Miami. Sean, if you want to start on that, and then Christy, if you want to pick up on it, feel free.
Yeah, sure. So the NFL is an inherently dangerous occupation. So we are focused on every type of injury. But of course, there are some injuries like Achilles or ACL tears that certainly result in more burden and missed time. We're certainly concerned with not only the acute effect of injury, but the long-term consequences of playing football. And I'm sure we'll get a bit more into that. But, we have a number of innovative research programs, including an occupational cohort study that looks at both the incidence and severity of illnesses and injuries that result from playing football and trying to understand the long-term consequences of those.
Yeah, I
Christy,
can build on that a little bit. I think all the projects we work on are fundamentally rooted in the data. We let the data tell us where we need to spend our time and attention. So there's a very detailed electronic medical record that allows us to look at injuries across the entire player population, across seasons. And it is really with that data that tells us, 9 of the top 11 most burdensome injuries are to the lower extremity, followed by concussions and shoulders. So our engineering group is focused on those injuries, of really trying to understand how they happen, what can we do to prevent them, when they do happen, what we can do to prevent them from having long-term consequences.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about that, Christy, specifically, mitigating maybe the risk of those injuries so that the injuries don't necessarily occur? And maybe we'll start with the lower body injuries that you mentioned, and then maybe transition to concussions.
Yeah, critical to understanding what the right prevention lever is to pull is really linking the rich data systems that we have available to us. So in addition to the injury details, we have information about the GPS of the players through the Next Gen Stats system that tells us how fast they ran, where, at what speed. And then we link that to the GSIS system, which is the game system and information system that gives us more details about the who, the when, the what. And once you look at all that together, it becomes clearer whether the intervention is technical through equipment evolution, whether it is behavior through changing training and technique, or whether it's through enforcement through the development or enforcement of the rules that we already have. So we kind of look at this holistically and use really one of those 3 levers often in concert to reduce the overall injury burden.
Mm-hmm. I think we could dive a little bit deeper into some of that and specifically talk about some of the technologies that you all are using. But let me give Jay a chance to jump in here. Jay, tell us a little bit more about your focus. It seems to me, based on the conversations we've had before this and the research that I've done, that your focus is more generally on life after football and looking at how that can be improved through measurement of data during career and post-career. Jay, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I would echo what Christy said about data, right? It's all about the data. And so we've been working on looking at the electronic health record that exists here and other places to really, can we use information that's already out there to better predict the onset of neurological disease using these data? And then also, what are some of the treatment courses that are effective? And so, when I think about this and I think about the information that the data that Christy's gathering, about injury, right? We know that there are some components of injury earlier in playing careers, or even in your just people who are not playing football, that lead to different or long-term health consequences. And so, I think about this as using data to raise a yellow flag or a red flag in terms of next steps of care and where people should be going, and even right provider at the right time.
Jay, and this is open to both you and Sean and Christy, frankly, but is it fair to say that some players have an easier time post-career when it comes to health-related issues? And what do you make of that? Is that a result in most instances of having less recognizable injuries during their playing career and then having a more healthful post career. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing there, and if you have answers to that question, I'd be very curious. And Sean, feel free to jump in too.
Yeah, I think you hit a lot. It's a multifactorial issue there, right? You've got certainly exposure and how they were treated post-exposure. Then you have pre-football and immediately post-football activities. And we're even looking at some genetics here, and then the type of care that they received in the league and post-league, right? We have we've got through our NFLPA trust program, I think so far more than 3,100 players have come through, and many of those players, the last time they see a physician is when they exit the league. And so, there's different initiatives that we can think about, again, using data to have these potential early interventions.
Yeah, and I don't think the work Jay is the work Jay has mentioned in terms of the trust program can't be overstated in terms of understanding the issue, but also intervening. And Jay and the rest of the trust program has just done an incredible job. But the longitudinal cohort study I mentioned, which is the football player health study at Harvard, is targeting exactly this question, Dan. And we call it my favorite buzzword, the maladaptive phenotype. Why some players with similar exposures do well in life after football and others don't. And as you can imagine, and as I think Jay said, it's a very complicated calculus with countless variables. But we've made a lot of progress so far with over 70 publications of findings to date, as well as advancing over 22 novel treatment interventions to various stages of translation. Just because I think it's interesting, one of the more surprising examples of a research finding when you look at longitudinal data is the relationship between myocardial dysfunction or heart attack and ACL tears. We actually learned a couple of years ago through the cohort study that an athlete with an ACL tear is 50% more likely to suffer a heart attack later in life. And that controls for things like BMI and activity level. So now the question then guides us to causation and how to effectively intervene for an issue like that.
Wow, interesting. Was there any control in that study that you know of for whether the athlete actually had surgery to repair the ACL versus not having the surgery to repair the ACL?
Yeah, we looked at the traditional reconstructions and the type of reconstruction, whether it's a patella, hamstring, cadaver graft, and the like.
Wow, fascinating. We've got some great questions coming in from the audience. Keep them coming, audience members, and upvote questions that you want us to get to. I'm going to get to one of them from Kyle Lisford. Kyle's question is, from the perspective of the NFLPA, how do you view the balance of data collection for injury prevention purposes versus player privacy concerns regarding their health information? Sean, you want to start?
Sure. It's a great question, and it's a complicated one. Certainly, as it relates to privacy, that is a high priority for the NFLPA, and it's complicated under federal labor law and an employer's argument that certain information is employment records versus protected health information. And we are constantly looking to dig that moat and protect players' personal information. But there is a lot of information in terms of aggregated, de-identified data that can be used to advance the research, advance the fields, advance our understandings on how to mitigate the long-term consequences of playing football.
And I think what I've found in talking with many of the players with some of our prevention efforts is they're a really motivated group to try to understand how to make the sport safer. And so I think they have the long-term vision that by analyzing these data streams and linking them in robust and rigorous ways, we're going to answer some important questions that may extend the length of their career or the players that follow them. So I just think that as a group, they're really motivated to use the information that we have to make the sport safer.
It's a great question. Thank you, Kyle, for submitting it. Keep the questions coming, everyone. I want to jump back to talk about maybe some specific examples of technologies that the NFLPA has used as it relates to athlete health. And I almost want to divide it into two segments, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but one being, technologies to prevent injuries, and then two being technologies to actually collect data to examine how the injuries occurred and hopefully change behavior to prevent those injuries going forward. I'll open this up to anyone who wants to jump in, but if no one chimes in, maybe I'll pick on someone. But, what are some examples maybe of, what the injury is and what the technology that you have seen really valuable is to address both of those points, preventing the injury and then assessing, how to make sure that the injury doesn't occur from a long-term perspective, from a data perspective.
Christy,
I can talk a little bit about the prevention part. One of the innovative projects we did this year in a pilot form is a lower extremity movement screen. So in a subset of clubs prior to the season, we used markerless motion capture to, in a very detailed way, study how players perform in a variety of football-related moves. And then we're relating that information to their injury history and their movement on the field using the detailed video we can collect in NFL games. And so by understanding whether their movement has a little bit of a fingerprint, like is there something about how they move through a variety of aerobic exercises that indicates either a protective effect with regard to injury or an increase in risk with regard to injury. Once we identify that, can we train them away from those risky movement fingerprints and actually prevent injuries? So we're really excited about having this data now. And one of our early use cases of trying to link this movement screen to injury outcomes is looking at hamstring strains. So hamstring strains, very common, can be burdensome and take a player out of games for several weeks. And so trying to understand the predictive ability of this technology to help us identify people early on and then train, rehab, instruct them to improve some of their movement kinematics so that they reduce the risk of injury.
Yeah, and speaking more globally, Dan, we use GPS tracking technology to monitor load, video reconstruction to understand every single injury, censored mouth guards to understand impact forces, and Christy can talk for days on that one, and advanced data analysis to both predict injury, but also to mitigate the long-term consequences and find the best ways to treat it. And on the prevention side, of course, there's a lot of helmet innovation ongoing, which is spurred by Christy's group and some folks at the league and the NFLPA partnership. But we're looking at bracing technology, the role that taping and spatting has played on lower extremity injuries. We have a shoulder pad work stream that's trying to understand that role and everything from concussions to shoulder injuries. And then in the lab, we're looking at things like soft bracing technology, innovative ways to prevent injury in ways that do not impede performance.
If I could add, Christy was talking about markerless technology and the quantification of movement to prevent injury. And we are taking that same type of technology and thinking about, because they're players today, but potentially they're patients tomorrow, and trying to use that technology to predict either neurological disease or even, again, as they age, fall risk, right? So those are, I think it's a great example of how, it's not about the technology. It's about using that data from the technology to answer these questions when they're playing, when they're retired, and even, quite frankly, expanding it beyond just into the general population as well.
I think what the technology allows us to do is to really allow this understanding to be at the individual level. Like before, we might group players according to position or some other broad category. But having this detailed technology, some of which is wearables that are measuring while they're, actively participating in the sport, really allows us to understand the risk and then direct the interventions on an individual level. And that really has the potential to make the most gains and the most impact on these players' lives immediately while they're playing football, and then as they move on in their post-football life.
Christy, I wanted to ask a question just out of my own curiosity from one of the things you mentioned, and that was the, adjusting certain movements if you know that a movement over time will result in maybe a longer term injury or an injury on the field, later that week. Is there any conflict between that kind of advice that might be given to a player or a team and then the coaching staff or the training staff that says, you can't make someone move in that way, they're not going to be able to perform as well? So it's almost this question of Is there pushback from the performance side when it comes to trying to mitigate injuries?
I think that what you illustrate is the need for this to really be a multidisciplinary effort. Mm-hmm. Me as an engineer might direct something in a particular direction that, as you said, is at odds with this player being able to perform his job and perform it well. And so we work closely with the strength and conditioning coaches and the medical staffs at the different clubs. We have work groups and task forces that are looking at these data together, because you need to have those different perspectives to understand how to integrate the information and come up with an intervention that's real, that's practical and implementable while these players are performing their jobs on the football field.
Very interesting. We've got some other good questions coming in. Let me get to them now. One from Rondell King. This is to Christy. Rondell, thanks for the question. How do you use biomechanical data to provide individualized programming? Is there a particular system or model in place for this?
So I think we look, the project example that I gave of the lower extremity movement screen, we're using markerless movement motion capture. And then that information is shared directly with the training staffs at the clubs to have that kind of one-on-one engagement. I would say more broadly, however, the other types of biomechanical measures, Sean mentioned the instrumented mouth guards, we're really trying to analyze that data by position and then within position to understand what are the characteristics of a given player that results in them sustaining either a high number of head impacts or larger magnitude head impacts, and then work with the coaching staffs to try to understand how to train or improve technique around that. So I think it varies by the research question or the injury problem we're after. But again, it comes down to partnerships with others. I'm not the one that's going to, tell that player how to change his technique, but I need to give the data in a digestible way to those that can instruct that player and understand how to kind of tweak what has been successful for him to get to the point he's already arrived at. What can he tweak to reduce his injury risk?
Thanks, Christy. Thanks, Rondell, for the question. I want to jump to a question that I had written down. I recall, I think during our prep call, that Sean or Jay had mentioned using AI and machine learning maybe as part of the injury prevention process, and then also as part of kind of the disease progression monitoring or potential for disease progression monitoring. Sean, am I right in recalling that? Is there more to expand on there?
Yeah, it's a great example of how the NFLPA is trying to innovate here and understanding the long-term consequences of football. And Jay's really at the center of that project. So Jay, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, please. Sure. Yeah, for sure. So again, what we're looking at here, Dan, is trying to use data that are already in an existing electronic health record. So we evaluated 7 million or so records over the course of over 20 years. And really what we've then now been looking at developing is, what are these common measures or common labs values, common other outcomes, musculoskeletal, neurological, et cetera, that are predictive, in fact, of neurological disease, ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and MS. So with that data, again, I think what it goes back to is using the data we have and then almost building care paths, especially for these guys, in terms of, okay, when you retire, you should be thinking about making sure you get these labs done, monitoring your sleep, et cetera, so that we can start, again, trying to raise these red or yellow flags related to the risk of disease. And our next phase is obviously going to look obviously at other musculoskeletal diseases or conditions, as well as looking at the treatment and the effectiveness of various treatments. Because again, if we can even potentially identify someone earlier, then potentially the utility of a given treatment might be even better.
Thank you, Jay. There's another question from the audience here from Jay Headley. Jay, thanks for the question. Jay notes that Zeke Elliott and others now wear the Rydell Axiom helmet, which has the Insight system built in. Sources tell me the NFL turns off that system and does not allow the impact data to flow. Why is that, and what has to be true to actually use that data? Is that a CBA issue, Sean?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Yes, in part is a CBA issue. Any censored equipment on field needs to be approved by the NFLPA. Any sort of device put on helmets needs to be approved by the NFLPA. There has not been a request submitted to us for use of that. However, there's something probably more globally worth mentioning here, which is the medical research application process, which is a collectively bargain process in place to ensure that any data collected from players on field or off for purposes of research is ultimately approved by the union, by the individual athlete, and ultimately by the league. And so if there's a data collection system being used on field, what's happening to that data? What's the validity of that data, and what's the downstream uses? That's all important for player privacy, which we talked about earlier.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for the question, Jay. Another question just came in. I think it's a good one from Arash Adami. Actually, Arash just submitted two questions, but Arash, I'm going to get to your first one. Does the NFLPA have an interest in working with companies that collect injury data from athletes before they enter the NFL, high school, and college? What can you say about that, Sean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, some of the programs Christy mentioned actually are deployed in the NCAA and lower levels of football because that longitudinal data value is extremely valuable. So the answer, Arash, is yes, certainly.
I want to jump to part of the title that we have here for this session, and that's not just health, but also wealth. And so I want to talk a little bit about how some of the technologies and the data collection can be used actually to commercialize or for commercialization purposes and therefore benefit the athlete. And I think it's certainly a long discussion. We could probably take up a whole nother half hour. We don't have that. But Sean, do you want to start and maybe we can figure out ways to integrate Jay and Christy as well?
Yeah, I mean, this is the fun stuff, if you ask me. I mean, the hard part about research is it takes such a long time. So we have intentionally built arms into our research efforts, specifically eyeing commercialization or translating promising medtech, for example. And we can talk more about data separately. A great example of this would be a company called Mioc Orthopedics, which is a technology called Bridge Enhanced ACL Repair. We discovered this technology when it was back in animal models. And the brilliant researcher, Dr. Martha Murray out of Boston Children's, had this vision to heal the ACL without atrophy from carving from other tendons, your patella or your hamstring, and without long-term osteoarthritis that comes from the traditional grafts, whether it's the carving from your own tendons or a cadaver. So basically, this technology is a surgeon taking cow collagen, 5 cc's of your own blood, suturing the ACL through the collagen, and you heal with your own nerve endings. Like most great innovations, the beauty is sort of in the simplicity of that. So the NFLPA, through its research program, supported this technology from animal models into safety trials and efficacy trial, and then into a $26 million Series A with big health tech players like Smith & Nephew, AMZARC, and DSM. And I just use that as one example. We have others of some really cool Star Trek sounding technologies like self-titrating hydrogels, a non-invasive glucose monitor that monitors glucose levels without taking blood, and that's a company called Socrates, an ultrasound-guided tendinopathy treatment for a company called Tendinova, and even things like antibody therapy for tau. And all of this is because of finding the foundation through research, having promising clinical data, and finding a technology that directly will benefit a player's health, and the NFLPA using its platform to help commercialize that. And then ultimately how that benefits not only the player's health, but the wealth. In a successful exit from that company, the money would go into the group licensing program that the NFLPA runs and be distributed out to the players in the National Football League.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for the question.
And I would add on that you know, some of the problems Sean was describing there, those are the same problems we have in medicine for people just off the street. And those technologies would have a huge impact on, and this is a great proving ground for them, just in medicine in general. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity there.
Thank you, Jay. I got a question from Tom Friend. Tom is an inside source here. He's a senior writer for SportTechie, but I think it's a good question. Tom wants to know more about the correlation between ACL tears and heart attack risk. It says, based on that correlation, how have you addressed this with the players from a prevention and awareness standpoint?
Yeah, it is a great question. It all comes down to education. Because we don't know the causation between these two data points, it's only correlated. We want to make sure all the players know about this. So all of our communication channels, whether it's the Trust and Jay's program, whether it's the football player health study at Harvard, whether it's our former player newsletter, we're constantly sharing this information out to the player population. And in this instance, encouraging earlier screening. I, for one, have had 5 knee surgeries in my life, and I wouldn't typically, based on traditional medical guidance, be at the age where I need to start getting my heart screened. But because of this information, I have done exactly that.
Thank you, Sean. Christy Gale has a question. Hey, Christy. Christy says, how do you protect player data during commercialization of their personal health data? Related to the health comment earlier, Sean, is there anything to expand when it comes to commercialization?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's going to depend on the type of data and the type of commercialization efforts. I mean, when you think about something like a normative data set, right, where you have an aggregated de-identified data set, if somebody wanted to create an app where it was like train like an offensive lineman, so it was a workout training app, the level of protection needed for something like that is very different than if you're commercializing an individual player's health records. And for something like the latter example, it would take full buy-in and consent from the individual athlete. I think an example of that you'll see is Pat Mahomes in our partnership with Whoop. Patrick used some of his Whoop data in connection with last year's playoffs and social marketing campaigns. He fully consented to that, the type of data, the validation levels, he was fully understanding of that, and got all full sign-off before that was used publicly. So it's sort of a tiered system in terms of the levels of protection.
Yeah, and I guess I can add a little bit to that, that even from our prevention standpoint, all of these initiatives that we have underway, whether it be instrumented mouth guard or this lower extremity screen or some of the footwear analyses we're doing, all of that comes with player consent. It involves an education effort with the players to help them understand what their data is being used for, but everything requires them to consent to participate in those side studies and use their data for analysis, whether that goes on to commercialization or just expanding the scientific knowledge.
Thank you both. And Christy, thanks for the question. So I've got one more question on my list that I'm going to ask, and it's related to a question that we have from the audience. So I'm going to tie both of them together. But before I do that, I just want to let everyone know that this will be available on demand at live.sporttechie.com, live.sporttechie.com. We do these SportTechie live episodes, try to do them twice a month at least. And we've got another one coming the week after Thanksgiving. So pay attention for the announcement of that one. So this question is similar to one that Arash asked as well. And Arash says, what advice do you have to startups on starting the conversation with the NFLPA to develop athlete safety technology? It's related to a question that I have, everyone, just which tends to go towards the direction of just how do you find companies that you want to work with? And also how do you evaluate those companies to make sure they're the right companies to work with?
Yeah, it's, again, another great question. And I'll start with the evaluation and then the finding of companies. But, you know, we have a deep bench of subject matter experts who advise us, folks like Jay and Christy, but also a scientific advisory board and a Mackey White Health and Safety Committee. These experts keep us abreast of new developments, new technologies, but also opine on new technologies when outside companies pitch us. But in terms of finding companies to work with, one of the ways we identify really innovative and disruptive companies is through our NFLPA Pitch Day. Pitch Day is a platform for diverse entrepreneurs to present their startup businesses to an elite judging panel of both investors and athletes. We actually have our 7th Pitch Day coming up here. It's going to be in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm going to give a little plug here. It's the week of Super Bowl, Wednesday, February 8th. And applications are now open, and we are actively recruiting for startups in the following categories: performance, health and wellness, innovation, tech and software, consumer products, gaming, and digital entertainment. So both on the commercialization side and on the health and safety side.
And I can assure you that Pitch Day is a great time. I've been there before. It's a great event, and I encourage startups to submit. So thanks for that, Sean. We are at the time mark. Sean and Jay and Christy, I want to thank you so much for the time. A virtual round of applause to you. To the audience, thank you so much for being here. There were some questions that we didn't get to. If we didn't get to them and you still want our panelists to answer them, please email them to stlive@sporttechie.com. That's S as in Sam, T as in Tom, live@sporttechie.com. And I'll filter them into the inboxes of our panelists and see if we can get them answered. Thanks, everyone, for the time. Have a great day.
Thanks, Dan.
Great. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, guys.